Welcome to the Lexington Public Library's Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast, where we discuss everything Lexington and Fayette County history. I'm Mariam, and in each episode of this podcast, we will feature a guest that will share a piece of local history. So thank you for tuning in and enjoy. For those of us that lived in Lexington, Kentucky through the 90s and early aughts, we remember a perennial candidate for governor named Gatewood Galbraith. Some people called him flamboyant and colorful, others called him the working man's hero. He was mostly known as a trailblazing candidate that campaigned to legalize cannabis. Either way, he left his mark on Kentucky politics and leaves us wondering how he would react to today's political landscape. On today's episode of Tales from the Kentucky Room, we have Matthew Strandmark, author of Gatewood, Kentucky's Uncommon Man, to share the deeper story of Gatewood Galbraith. Matthew is an educator, researcher, and archivist. He serves as the education archivist and academic liaison to the Appalachian Studies Department at the University of Kentucky Special Collections Research Center. We are so excited to have him with us today to talk about this Kentucky legend. Hi, Matthew. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. So you released this book, Gatewood, Kentucky's Uncommon Man. Tell us a little bit more about why you got into the research on Gatewood Galbraith and what interested you to write a whole book about it.
Yeah, definitely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Big fan of Lexington Public Libraries and all the great work that you all do, so it's an honor to be here for sure. I first got acquainted with Gatewood, so I'm not actually from Kentucky.
Okay.
I'm from Indiana. I don't share that too often, even though I am an archivist at
We forgive you.
Oh, thank you. The University of Kentucky Special Collections Research Center. But the first way I became acquainted with Gatewood was that we have his collection of personal papers given by his family after he passed away in 2012, which went through the process of, being organized and being open to researchers. And once those did open, I was in charge of curating an exhibit that was on display at our library and then on display at actually the central branch of the Lexington Public Library back in 2017. So that was the first time I ever heard about or learned about Gatewood, and I was immediately hooked. I mean, he's just such an interesting and engaging character in Kentucky politics when you don't oftentimes have a lot of that from other people who are in the political establishment or have been around for a long time. So I kind of did a lot of research and helped to curate that exhibit that traveled a couple different places and kind of put it away after that, even though it was a really fascinating collection. When we did receive his papers, they actually started an oral history project where they interviewed mainly his family members, his daughters, and things like that. So we had about 15 interviews, and especially during COVID, when I had been thinking about this for a while, that there wasn't a newer biography about Gatewood and about the impact that he had, is what kind of got me interested in restarting that. So I did about 35 more oral history interviews, pretty much all virtual or over the phone, because as you all know, we were stuck at home for a long time. Yeah, so those started in December of 2020. And through those interviews, it just became really clear to me that there was a bigger story that needed to be told, and it was interesting and engaging, and it was also really kind of culturally and politically salient, especially with recent movements that we've seen regarding access to medical and recreational cannabis, not only in Kentucky very, very recently, but, obviously throughout the country over the past decade or so, just kind of how much that tide is.
And that's how most of us that did grow up here in Lexington know Gatewood Galbraith, is his advocacy towards legalizing cannabis. Very few of us know his origins, though. Can you just give us a little bit of background about where he came from and kind of what kind of shaped him to be the trailblazing person that he was? Right,
of course. Yeah. So Gatewood actually grew up in Carlisle, Kentucky, in Nicholas County, part of a really big Catholic family. So he was the middle of 7 children and, grew up, as he described it, almost like this idyllic, Mayberry type setting to have as a childhood with this very, very big and rambunctious family. And this is really, Carlisle stayed in his heart even after they moved to Lexington when he was in the beginning of his teenage years and when he started to progress and go through school and eventually go to UK as well as UK law school. But he always really valued the role of those rural communities, of farmers, of identifying with people in Kentucky who maybe didn't have a lot, but had very tight-knit communities and were trying to like keep that way of life, alive, for lack of a better term. So that really formed and shaped Gatewood a lot. His family obviously did as well. I had the honor of speaking to most of his siblings for this, and even a few his oldest brother Hank, who I interviewed for this, had since passed away. And, they were just a very, very close, fun family. Gatewood growing up his entire life, he was always the kind of the most rambunctious, most mischievous of the bunch. They would often joke that when his parents wanted to go on a date, they would get 2 babysitters, one for the other 6 kids and then one for Gatewood. So he, from the time that he was growing up, and especially as his older siblings remembered, he was just this kind of stand-up comedian, always wanted to be the center of attention. He actually suffered from a fair amount of like ailments growing up, which is kind of interesting to learn about, and kind of how that shaped him. A couple things that were maybe somewhat self-inflicted, like some internal injuries that he had to spend some time in the hospital for when he was a kid. He also had this ailment where when his mother was pregnant with him, she was prescribed for a bacterial infection, a medicine called tetracycline. And tetracycline causes, especially in kids, like the malformation of teeth. So he had very like yellow and like brittle teeth that were a pain for a long time. He eventually actually had all those pulled when he was in 8th grade and wore dentures the rest of his life.
Yeah.
But it kind of like, once he went through these transformations, for a while he was shut up in his house just having to read books and kind of like dreaming about what his life could be. So once he got the chance to like kind of break out and do that, he was never gonna
go back
compromise compromise that chance. Yeah. And then also once he had those teeth taken care of, it kind of allowed him to come fully out of his shell and be very gregarious. And again, ended up going to school at Lexington Catholic and then Lafayette High School, where he graduated before he ended up at UK and then UK Law School. I think most people, and that's kind of the origin, I think most people will probably know and remember Gatewood as this kind of like perennial political candidate. And I'm sure we can talk more about how these beliefs were formed. But he ran for election 9 different times. He ran for governor 5 times. He ran for Congress. He ran for attorney general, for agriculture commissioner as well.
Why did he go into politics, though? Like, I know that he was a practicing lawyer. Why did he veer towards politics specifically? Yeah.
Even before he finished law school at the University of Kentucky, Gatewood wrote something when he was about a 1L law student, a first-year law student, called the Model Plan for Legal Marijuana. And what this was basically about a 30-page document that set out and illustrated how he thought like marijuana could benefit especially farmers in Kentucky. So it described the system of allotments and a taxation system that would be centrally controlled by the state government and things like that. This kind of became like what he would preach for the next like 30 years in public life. So he basically had these very big and grandiose ideas, especially about cannabis, but really about a lot of other topics and beliefs as well. And this idea about, he always had this kind of passion and belief for putting things in the public marketplace, he had the skills to be a great speaker, to be able to connect with crowds, which he used in the courtroom oftentimes to connect with juries, and was really known for being a talented speaker. So because of his personality, because of how he grew up, because of these beliefs that he had, because of the skills that he had to be able to go out and not be afraid to talk in front of crowds of people, it was kind of the logical next step for him to come up with these ideas that he thought were really great and then to kind of put them into the public marketplace. And he thought, what better marketplace is there than being able to have people vote for you. So
exactly.
That was his first kind of breakthrough in 1983 when he ran for agriculture commissioner, and just running in the primary for that, the Democratic primary for that. That was kind of his first taste of it. And then he was just immediately.
Yeah. And then he would go on to run for, I believe, 5 gubernatorial races. Again, everybody knows him as a perennial candidate. Yeah. I don't know if it's because of my age and around the time that I became politically aware of the local landscape, the Kentucky landscape, but I just remember 1991 being when I first became aware of Gatewood Galbraith. Would you consider that to be a pivotal year for him in terms of his space that he took on the political landscape here in Kentucky?
Yeah, certainly. And that was his first campaign for governor, first of all. So it was kind of, putting his name out there in the biggest race in the entire state. Not a lot of people knew him leading up to that. Had only run for agriculture commissioner. So that was kind of the first time that he was seen really, really widely running in that Democratic primary in 1991. This is also the race where he first came to meet Willie Nelson. And Willie Nelson, there's an interesting story about basically Gatewood had pretty much run out of money, which was a recurring theme throughout Gatewood's life and political campaigns. And he spent pretty much all of his money to have a professional recording done, like a one-on-one interview, just him talking into a camera, and then had it broadcast basically wherever he could in Lexington, usually like either public access or networks at like 2 or 3 a.m., where he could afford it. And it just so happened that Willie Nelson was driving through Kentucky on one of his tours leading up to that election, and he just happened to see this interview with Gatewood.
How serendipitous.
I know. And so he called and somehow got in touch with Gatewood. They met and they became really close friends. Gatewood flew to Texas and met him, and they played golf together and did all this stuff. But also Willie Nelson started to appear, which he would go on to do for the next 20 years or so, and play like fundraising concerts for Gatewood as well. It was this kind of like combination of him running for the biggest and most popular and that got the most media, this like statewide office, but also like this new celebrity brought a lot more energy and attention to his campaign as well. So that's when most people became acquainted with Gatewood for sure.
Yeah. So the title of your book is Kentucky's Uncommon Man, Gatewood, Kentucky's Uncommon Man. Reading it and just knowing a little bit about Galbraith and his ideologies, would you consider him an uncommon man now if he is with us today? A lot of his ideas are currently very popular, maybe not in this state, but nationwide. Would you consider him to be like a more progressive candidate?
Yeah, it's really, and again, I've been asked this a lot because it's, it's so tempting to be able to translate like where he was maybe unsuccessful in the past to where we are today. And it's funny, like these interviews I did, I would often ask that of people like Ernie Fletcher or Ben Chandler or Paul Patton, these people I interviewed and talked to, and pretty much everybody would have a different answer
depending on their own.
So while a lot of his ideas, especially related to cannabis, which he got the most media attention for sure when he was kind of in the public eye, are way more palatable now and within what we call like the Overton window, right, where you can actually fundraise and win campaigns on these things. Gatewood was also kind of impossible to pin down as to be like one certain thing. So you mentioned progressive, like he was very progressive in calling for cannabis reform and calling for environmental protections, ending mountaintop removal mining, a lot of those efforts. But he was also, especially later in his political life, became very much known for Second Amendment and gun rights, was anti-abortion pretty much the entire time he was running for office as well. So it was very difficult to pin down kind of what he was. He had these very progressive ideas, but he would often say that, like, I'm the only conservative in this race. Like, Mitch McConnell and George Bush are aliens. They're not conservatives. Like, you know what I mean? He would often say that on a campaign trail. And a lot of this was just going back to the fact that he had this real belief, this very much libertarian belief before we saw like some of the later libertarians. So he had this very libertarian belief that, and he would say this often in his speeches, that the government had grown too big, basically, that it should be put back in the little box where it belongs and should stay out of your bloodstream and your bedroom and all these different things that he was kind of known for making these alliterations. So while he did have these like very progressive political beliefs in some areas, in other areas, he's much closer to conservative libertarian candidates that we're more familiar with today. So it's kind of interesting to think about, because I think even now it would be hard to put him in a box, especially tied to the fact that he kind of refused to try and fundraise or to like compromise any of his positions or beliefs to be able to raise more money, which would have undoubtedly made him more successful in a lot of these races if he could have moderated some of those things and gotten money from special interests or gotten money from different groups. And he would, even when he was out of money and driving across the state on his own dime to appear at all these forums and to speak at bingo halls, would never kind of compromise those beliefs in order to become more successful. So, you know, when you see like the most recent governor's race cost like what, $49 million,
that's
I think,
incredible.
combined.
Yeah.
You know, I find it hard to believe that he would have been like a mainstream like operator.
And that was one of his downfalls is the way money was always strapped for him as a candidate. On page 164 of your book, you talk a little bit about how he felt a little bit of a sense of guilt about the whole cannabis issue kind of overshadowed everything else that he was advocating for. And that just became, his spiel, basically.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, I'm going to read this passage. And
Sure.
it really struck me about who he was towards the end of his life as a political person. So you say Gatewood constantly felt a sense of guilt about the lack of progress he was making on reforming cannabis laws in Kentucky, even though he went so far as to step back from his firm stance on legalization in his recent campaigns, trying to make himself more politically palatable. It didn't have much effect, partly because he still admitted to using cannabis personally, and partly because this was the issue that got him constant media attention. He could talk all he wanted about fighting against political corruption, for Second Amendment rights, for environmental protections, or for vocational education. But ever since his first race in 1983, he had been stamped as the marijuana candidate. It turned out that voters in Kentucky and the news reporters who followed the campaigns had a long memory. And when one issue kind of overshadows his whole political ideology from the other issues that were very important to him as well, if he had somebody maybe around him, or if he had the money to sort of help him shape his political aura or whatever, I feel like he probably would have been a little more successful. So that always makes me wonder, like, if he had somebody around him to help him help him sell his ideology. Exactly. Frame it up. Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, and that, I think that pretty much explains it. It's a great excerpt to kind of explain it, like you mentioned, because it was this double-sided sword that he constantly had to deal with throughout his life. Because, once you are able to get a taste, once you're able to get a few newspaper articles written about you, once you show up on the news and you realize it's because you are bringing forth information about an issue or advocating for an issue that is like very culturally splashy and interesting. It's hard, especially for somebody who doesn't have a lot of money and didn't have a lot of name recognition early on, and especially in that 1991 race. I mean, not a lot of name recognition in the way that people might have known him, when he was running for things in 2002 or in 2011 or something like that. That you have to be able to get media attention if you hope to have any hope in any of these races. So it was kind of like, could he thread the needle of making headlines for that and then also slip in all these other things that were equally important, at least to him, about? And oftentimes that wasn't the case, because he maybe wasn't as competitive in these races as he could be because of money and because of all these other reasons. Or like you mentioned, not having a big team, not having political consultants, not having people there to kind of shape his message. But also, like, once those cameras start turning away, once the newspaper reporters stop showing up, you're going to bring that issue back out, because you have to get some kind of oxygen for your campaign. So like you mentioned, kind of stuck in this like in between world of attention and no attention.
The other thing I found interesting is you mentioned in your book about his influence on Mayor Teresa Isaac, about the whole water company issue and condemning the water company, et cetera. I did not realize that he was such an influence on her in terms of that issue. And originally, that's pretty much what got her both elected and what lost her her second race. It got me thinking, like, who else other than Mayor Teresa Isaac did he influence? Did he have a good connection with in Kentucky politics?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say, and he knew Mayor Isaac going back to I think they met at law school at UK, and I think probably less so him having a political influence on candidates in Kentucky, and more so having kind of a cultural influence, because even when he wasn't running for office, especially, he had, some bigger gaps there, especially in the 2000s, like when she was elected mayor. He had a radio show. He appeared regularly with Tom Martin and other people on WVLK and these other was a contributor to a lot of these talk radio shows and things like that. So I think that is probably where he had a lot more influence, which I think he probably kind of liked, and maybe Gatewood was almost more built for, because you can imagine Gatewood hosting a hour-long talk radio and having people call in and being able to talk about politics and things like that. So I think maybe sometimes maybe not as much with Mayor Isaac, but maybe a little bit overstated a bit, just because of like the persona you have to be when you're, kind of a media personality and an attorney. I mean, how he was drumming up a lot of business was his kind of like name recognition, which also helped all the elections that he ran in and people knowing him and knowing his name. So I think it's more so that he had this kind of like, because he was this local Kentucky and then even more local Lexington, like almost like folk hero almost, or kind of a personality that people were familiar with and knew well, that he could kind of suggest maybe that he was having more of an influence on maybe local races and things like that, which is interesting when you think about it, because a lot of these people I interviewed they were like, he should have just started out running for city council or running for mayor or something like that and working his way up.
But that wasn't him.
And it just wasn't him. Absolutely not. It wasn't him. He would often joke that, like, if he ever won, he was good friends with, for example, like Terry McBrayer, and he would often joke with him that if he ever ended up winning one of these races, Terry would have to come and do all the actual day-to-day work for him, because he wouldn't know how to do it. Not to say that Gatewood wouldn't figure that out, but it was much more that he was trying to create this public image, trying to put his ideas out there, and trying always like taking the biggest swing that he possibly could, rather than being interested in these kind of like incremental, steps towards influence, I guess.
In your research, what surprised you the most about Gatewood Galbraith?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Probably what surprised me the most, and there's probably a few things. There's probably a few things I didn't even include in the book. I mean, it was so interesting. I think probably what surprised me the most when I'm looking at it from a bird's eye view were just how many people had personal relationships with Gatewood and how many people had personal stories about Gatewood. So that's kind of the biggest part of this, is that Gatewood wrote an autobiography where he traced a lot of the same things, followed through a lot of these campaigns, obviously one-sided and obviously like with this like public image in mind. And people knew Gatewood as being splashy and being loud and appearing in all these races and things like that. But what this allowed me to do was get to know Gatewood almost on a personal level, which, obviously I couldn't do since he had passed away before I was ever here at UK. And so being able to hear about just kind of who he was in private compared to who he was in public was really interesting. And a lot of that goes back to how he was raised, about his very tight-knit family. Gatewood was extremely charitable, caring, spent a lot of time representing people pro bono, especially like in marijuana possession cases when he did not have the money or the time to be representing people pro bono. Some of the people I interviewed would often say that, Gatewood would take your last nickel, but he would also give you his last nickel. So it was a good illustration of the fact that like he really did care about people. And I think that was illustrated in a lot of what we've talked about, how he wasn't taking money from special interests, how he wasn't willing to compromise on a lot of these beliefs, because he didn't believe them because he thought he was electable. He believed them because he genuinely believed them. And he, throughout his entire time running for political office, he was never willing to compromise those beliefs and never willing to compromise that. He honestly, to his core, thought that these were the best ideas, the best principles that were going to help the most people in Kentucky. And I think that's why he became really, widely loved and also seen as anti-establishment and all this, is because he was intimately connected and able to make connections with what we might call the common man. So that's kind of where a lot of the illustration in Kentucky's Uncommon Man comes into play, is that he was this uncommon, splashy, huge figure who, at his core, relied on this connection with the most common people in Kentucky, with the poor, with farming communities, with people who were struggling. There were so many stories of him when he didn't have a lot of money, stopping and breaking a $50 bill and going around downtown Lexington and giving money away to people who were on the street, for example. Or I had another story told me by his brother Hank, where he basically was representing a college student had her car towed, and she didn't have the money to get it out, and he basically got so much more money for her and her car back, gave her a call to come in and pick up the check. He handed it to her, and she was like, "How much do I owe you?" And he was like, "I've got 3 daughters in college, and I know you don't have a lot of money. Don't worry about it. I was happy to do it." So you don't often hear this, one, for people in politics, and 2, for attorneys.
Yes.
Quite honestly. And I don't mean that to disparage attorneys in any way, but he was oftentimes extremely selfless in doing this work, and then on the flip side was sometimes blind to sometimes how selfish he was being because of the decisions
how it affected the
making.
people around him.
Exactly.
Yeah. Either way, he left his legacy on Kentucky politics and Lexington in general. I think so. Kudos to you on the research.
Yeah, thank you very much. And if I can just say, I mean, just real quickly, just speaking about legacy, the biggest thing for this book was hopefully to illustrate the fact that, I work with undergraduate students on a daily basis at UK. Not very many people know about, Gatewood. It's been 12 and a half years since he passed away. It hasn't been on the political scene. What I hope this does, at least in some way, is show people that he deserves some credit for a lot of what has happened in Kentucky, especially, regarding medical cannabis as well.
Yes.
I don't think people often realize, how big this problem is in Kentucky. Kentucky is the second worst state in the country for arresting and prosecuting people of color for marijuana possession. The only state behind us is Montana. So you're 9.72 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession in Kentucky if you're black compared to if you're white.
Yeah.
The same way in the past 20 years, and this is from the Kentucky Center for Economic Policy, there have been 300,000 people in Kentucky arrested for marijuana possession.
That's incredible.
So it's interesting to have these big figures and for these things to be printed, but oftentimes people don't understand that it doesn't stop with being arrested and paying a fine.
No, because it affects you long term.
Exactly.
Yeah,
it's like
it's
a
a
weight
record
around these people's necks who it makes it harder to find a job, makes it harder to find a place to live, makes it harder to make ends meet, makes it harder to keep families together as well. So I think sometimes it's been kind of like flippantly looked at, especially by members of the Kentucky state legislature and things like that, as just this kind of like stoner issue or something like that. And it's very much, a well-being and like cultural, issue here in Kentucky, and a culture of justice, quite honestly, needs to be laid out. Not only luckily having access to medical cannabis and fighting back against the horrible opioid epidemic that we suffer here, some of the worst in the country, and how that is going to go on to help people and to save thousands of lives, but also the next step needs to be taken to pass recreational marijuana, and not only that, but also to go back and expunge the records of people who are being affected by.
Yeah. It's been a long fight with legalizing medical marijuana. It's not something that just kind of will happen. And there's got to be some sort of groundwork laid down if it is legalized. A lot of the states that have legalized marijuana, the last people to benefit from it are people of color. So it's interesting to see who the people that came before us to kind of lay the groundwork, and just be aware of that and be grateful to them that they were.
And the day will come. I'm confident the day will come. I'm not sure how many years it'll be, but I've been telling people whenever I speak at conferences or anything like that about this book is that when it does happen, it needs to be named the Gatewood Galbraith.
Yes,
definitely. That's my insistence for.
So talk to us a little bit more about where you work, your day-to-day job at the special collections at UK. And what you do. Yeah,
definitely. So I'm lucky to be a faculty member with UK Libraries. So I work at the Special Collections Research Center at Margaret I. King Library on Central Campus at UK. So my official, day-to-day title is Education Archivist. So what I do is I basically work with faculty members to teach class sessions or entire class projects, things like that, of undergraduate students at UK. So they come in and we, depending on topic, depending on discipline, depending on what the class is, we will utilize these primary sources, these historical archival sources. A lot of times students have never seen or know that archives existed, which is totally fair. And so being able to help them do research and explore and use them and create original scholarship. So that's kind of what I do on a daily basis to try and support undergraduate learning within special collections and within UK libraries as a whole. I also manage oral history interview projects, as we mentioned, with the Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History, which is one of the leading oral history centers in the country and does amazing work. So I'm able to lead various oral history projects and do interviews. So I'm
kind of like
it's strange to be on the other side of the table, but so the current project I've been working on is to do interviews with the faculty members at UK who are part of the Commonwealth Institute for Black Studies. So we have affiliate faculty members all across the university who teach in a variety of disciplines and things like that, but all centered on Black Studies. That was established in 2020 at UK and led by Dr. Anastasia Kerwood. And so it's been so interesting to learn about all the different work that's going on and just this vast community of scholars that's being formed at UK that was entirely missing before this work was done. There's long been scholars who have done African American studies and Africana studies at UK, but bringing them together and creating this very academic kind of community of the work that they're doing is just unbelievably valuable. And the community outreach work that's going on between the university that was absent for a long time with the city of Lexington, it's been great to learn about. In addition to that, I'm also the Appalachian Studies liaison. So I work with a lot of the Appalachian Studies faculty to make sure they have library resources that they need and to support the work that they're doing.
That sounds like such an
incredible. In addition to a lot of other boring mailing and
it's not boring to us. You're
I'm in the right place.
Exactly. That's incredible work. And a lot of it can be found on the website. The Nunn Center has a website that people can look at all the great work you guys are doing over there. So
KentuckyOralHistory.org. So thousands of interviews available for anybody to view for free.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming here and sharing your research with us. You've been listening to our podcast on Gatewood Galbraith with Matthew Strandmark. Thanks for listening to Tales from the Kentucky Room, a podcast brought to you by the Central Library's Kentucky Room staff at the Lexington Public Library. If you enjoyed listening, please take a minute to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you have any questions about local history or genealogy research, you can visit us in the Kentucky Room to use our collection and newspaper microfilm, or you can email us at elibrarian@lexpublib.org. That's elibrarian@lexpublib.org. I'm Mariam, and we'll be back with another trip down Lexington's memory lane.